It was supposed to be a quiet night. The streets were empty, the kind of stillness that only comes when an entire neighborhood has turned in for the evening. But when the homeowner pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. The garage light was on, even though no one had touched it, and the gate that usually hung closed was bent, its lock hanging in jagged, broken pieces. The Jeep, their Jeep, was gone. Tire marks streaked across the pavement, fresh and undeniable. It wasn't stolen by some random thief in the night. Witnesses had already seen who orchestrated it, the HOA president, standing smugly in the driveway, watching as the vehicle was hauled away. She thought she was untouchable. She thought cutting a lock and seizing property was within her power. What she didn't know was that the Jeep wasn't just a car. It was tied to a law enforcement task force. And in crossing that line, she hadn't just overstepped her authority. She had stepped straight into criminal territory. This is the story of how one HOA president's obsession with control brought an entire community to the breaking point, and how the theft of a single Jeep led to her very public downfall. The neighborhood had the kind of charm that made real estate listings sound like glossy brochures. Tree-lined streets, freshly cut lawns, houses that all seemed to mirror one another in size and shape. To most people driving through, it looked like the picture of peace, safe, orderly, even idyllic. For families who wanted stability, for retirees who wanted quiet, and for newcomers who wanted to feel like they made it, this community seemed like the perfect fit. For one homeowner, it started out exactly that way. After years of saving, the dream of settling into a quiet suburb finally came true. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs, a small sanctuary tucked away in a community that promised harmony. At first, everything felt right. Neighbors waved politely in the mornings, kids rode bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and the occasional community barbecue made everyone feel like part of something bigger. The rules of the Homeowners Association, though strict, seemed harmless at first glance. No unkempt lawns, no mismatched fences, no parking in the wrong spots. A binder full of policies came with the house keys, but most of it was filed away and forgotten. The goal was simple: follow the basics, live in peace, and for a while, that's exactly how things went. Life had a steady rhythm. Weekdays were filled with commutes and work. Weekends were for errands, yard work, and the satisfaction of watching a home slowly come together with personal touches. A new garden bed, a carefully chosen paint color, small improvements that made the space feel alive. It was the kind of ordinary happiness that doesn't make headlines but feels priceless when you're living it. But in communities like this, harmony often came with strings attached. The same neat streets and matching fences that gave the neighborhood its uniform charm were also policed with a quiet intensity. The HOA was more than just a group of volunteers. It was a system of control dressed up as order. Most residents stayed on its good side, either out of habit or fear of confrontation. But every so often someone would stand out, someone whose choices, however small, would attract attention. The first hints of tension were subtle. A letter slipped into the mailbox, worded in polite but firm language. A reminder about adherence to community standards. A casual comment from a neighbor, delivered with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. At first it seemed easy to brush off, just paperwork, just formality, nothing worth worrying about. Still, there was a feeling that lingered, a sense of being watched a little too closely, of rules that could shift depending on who was enforcing them. The community that once seemed welcoming now carried an undercurrent of unease, like the calm before a storm. The homeowner didn't know it yet, but the house they had poured their heart into was about to become the center of a conflict that went far beyond lawns and fences. A conflict that would expose just how far certain people were willing to go when they believed the neighborhood belonged to them. The first letter had been easy to ignore. It was written in stiff formal language about community standards and compliance, but it didn't even specify a real violation, just vague talk about observed concerns regarding property maintenance. The homeowner tossed it aside, assuming it was a generic reminder sent to everyone. But the second letter wasn't vague at all. It arrived in a bright envelope marked Notice of Infraction. The problem, according to the HOA, the homeowner's Jeep parked in the driveway. They claimed the vehicle was unsightly and in violation of neighborhood aesthetics. At first, the accusation was almost laughable. The Jeep wasn't some rusting clunker. It was in good condition, clean and well maintained. It wasn't blocking sidewalks or overflowing onto the street. It simply didn't fit the board's narrow definition of what belonged in their carefully curated image of the community. The notice demanded that the Jeep be moved to the garage immediately. Failure to comply, it warned, would result in daily fines. At first, the homeowner felt a wave of disbelief. How could they dictate what vehicle someone owned? More importantly, how could they decide what was unsightly? The language was subjective, intentionally so. It left all the power in the hands of the HOA, where rules could bend depending on personal bias. Still, the homeowner wanted to avoid conflict. The Jeep was parked outside because the garage was filled with tools, storage, and the kind of clutter that builds up in any family's life. Clearing space wasn't impossible, but it wasn't something that could be done overnight either. A week passed, then another, and by the third notice, the fines began. They started small, $25 a day, but they stacked quickly. By the end of the month, the fines had ballooned into hundreds of dollars. Every new letter was worded more aggressively, each one threatening further action if compliance wasn't immediate. The mailbox, once filled with junk mail and catalogues, had become a source of dread. Neighbors began whispering. Some avoided eye contact, clearly aware of what was happening. Others gave small, pitying smiles, the kind that said, "I know, but I don't want to get involved." And then there were the few who watched too closely, who lingered just a little longer when they passed by the driveway. That's when the harassment began to feel personal. One morning, the Jeep's tires were chalked, as if someone were marking how long it stayed in place. Another time, the homeowner noticed fresh scratches along the driver's side door, shallow but deliberate. There was no proof of who had done it, but suspicion pointed in one direction. The same board members who had made it their mission to enforce the rules with selective cruelty. The letters escalated into threats of towing. The HOA claimed the Jeep could be removed at the homeowner's expense if it wasn't moved. The very idea that they could invade personal property like that was enraging, but the board acted as though they held all the authority. The homeowner tried calling, tried reasoning, even attended a board meeting to speak directly. The response was cold, dismissive, and condescending. The president of the HOA didn't even hide her disdain as she explained that community standards exist for a reason, and exceptions can't be made for personal convenience. It wasn't about the Jeep, it was about control. The homeowner felt the walls closing in. Each day was filled with a mix of anger and helplessness. The place that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battleground. Every trip to the mailbox carried the dread of another fine. Every glance from a neighbor felt like silent judgment. The community that had seemed so perfect at first had turned into a cage, one where every move was scrutinized. And then, one night, the line was crossed. Returning home late, the homeowner noticed the garage light on. At first, panic set in. Had someone broken in? But as they pulled into the driveway, the truth hit harder than any burglary could. The Jeep wasn't where it had been. The lock on the gate had been cut, jagged edges of metal still clinging to the chain. Tire marks streaked across the pavement, leading away. The HOA had gone beyond letters and fines. They had taken the Jeep. By the time the police report had been filed, the HOA president still believed she was untouchable. For weeks, she carried herself as though the community was her kingdom, as though she had the authority to strip locks, confiscate vehicles, and fine people into submission. She had weathered complaints before, and every time she came out on top. This time, she thought, would be no different. But things didn't unfold the way she imagined. The investigation gained momentum, and the quiet suburb that once thrived on order and appearance began buzzing with tension. Squad cars parked at curbs, officers knocked on doors, neighbors whispered about subpoenas and warrants. And in the center of it all stood the homeowner, no longer the quiet resident singled out for a jeep in the driveway, but the person whose patience had finally snapped. At first, the HOA president dismissed it as a bluff. "Police property?" she scoffed at one board meeting. "That's just a scare tactic. No one here is above the rules." But her bravado faltered the moment she was served with an official notice. She was under investigation for criminal interference with government equipment. The smug smile she once wore like armor began to crack. What she hadn't realized was that every decision she made, every letter, every fine, every order, had been documented. The homeowner had kept a meticulous record: dates of notices, photographs of the Jeep, images of the cut lock, copies of every inflated fine. What she thought was harassment carried out in private was now evidence stacked neatly against her. The moment of truth arrived at a packed community meeting. Attendance had swelled, not out of interest in bylaws or landscaping, but because word had spread. This was the night everything came to light. Chairs scraped across the polished floor of the clubhouse as neighbors filled every corner, buzzing with curiosity and unease. The president sat at the head of the long table, flanked by the other board members, her chin lifted in defiance. But her eyes darted nervously whenever the police officers at the back of the room shifted their weight. The homeowner didn't need to raise their voice. They simply laid out the facts, one by one. The letters that turned vague complaints into crippling fines. The photographs of the Jeep, perfectly maintained, showing the absurdity of calling it unsightly. The report of the lock that had been cut. Proof of forced entry, proof of trespassing. And finally, the detail that left the room in stunned silence. The Jeep wasn't just any car. It was a registered law enforcement vehicle. Gasps echoed through the room. The revelation hung heavy in the air. For the first time, the president's mask slipped. Her lips parted as though to argue, but no words came. She fumbled with her papers, but nothing could erase the fact that she had crossed a line no amount of neighborhood authority could excuse. The officers in the back stepped forward, their presence now impossible to ignore. They confirmed what the homeowner had said. The Jeep wasn't just impounded, it had been illegally seized. And because of that, the investigation wasn't just about HOA overreach anymore. It was about tampering with government property. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their collective silence had made them complicit. Neighbors who once supported the president, or at least tolerated her, now stared with wide eyes and furrowed brows. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into accusations. The community's faith in its own leadership was unraveling before everyone's eyes. And then came the question that sealed her fate. Under whose authority did you order that vehicle removed? The room went still. The president's face flushed, her voice catching in her throat. She stammered about community standards, about bylaws, about the importance of aesthetics. But no one was convinced. The more she spoke, the clearer it became. She had acted not out of duty, but out of spite. She had overstepped not because the rules demanded it, but because she wanted control. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. For months, the homeowner had been the one under scrutiny, the one punished, the one humiliated. Now, all eyes were on her. The once respected figure of authority was shrinking in her chair, her defenses collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. The night of the meeting had been the breaking point, but the story of the HOA president's downfall didn't end there. In many ways, it was only the beginning. What followed was a slow unraveling of the power structure that had controlled the neighborhood for years, a process that revealed not only the corruption of one person, but the fragility of the system she had built. The investigation moved forward quickly. The police had already gathered evidence, but the Jeep itself was the centerpiece. It had been recovered with signs of tampering, its lock and glove compartment clearly forced open. Though nothing was missing, the fact that anyone had even attempted to access its contents was damning. Combined with the cut gate lock and eyewitness accounts, the case painted a clear picture. The president had ordered the removal of a vehicle she had no right to touch, and in doing so had interfered with government property. Charges were filed: criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and interference with law enforcement equipment. The words themselves were heavy enough, but when they were spoken aloud in the community, they hit like thunder. Neighbors who had once respected her position recoiled at the thought of what she had done. What came next was a ripple effect of consequences. The president was forced to step down from her role, stripped of her position, and barred from serving on any future board. Fines she had levied against the homeowner were overturned, wiped clean by legal mandate. And perhaps most crushing of all, her reputation was in tatters. She could no longer walk through the neighborhood without hearing the whispers, without feeling the eyes of those she had once controlled, now burning with disdain. For the homeowner, the resolution was more than just personal victory. The Jeep was returned, the fines erased, and the sense of violation finally acknowledged. But the true impact stretched further. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to find their voices. They shared their own stories of unfair fines, petty threats, and quiet intimidation. Together, they began drafting changes to the bylaws, reforms that ensured no one person could wield unchecked power again. The community, once fractured by fear, started to heal. Barbecues returned, conversations flowed freely, and the sense of neighborliness that had been overshadowed by control began to resurface. The HOA still existed, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a structure rebuilt on fairness, transparency, and accountability. And as for the homeowner, the driveway once again felt like a place of peace. The Jeep sat parked proudly in its rightful spot, no longer a symbol of conflict, but of perseverance. Every time the engine turned over, it carried with it the memory of a battle fought and won, not just against one president, but against the misuse of power itself. The HOA president, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale. Her name, once spoken with deference, was now met with eye rolls and bitter laughs. She had tried to rule through fear, but in the end, she had only exposed her own weakness. The story closed not with a shout, but with a lesson that even in the quietest of neighborhoods, even under the guise of order and harmony, power unchecked will always find a way to corrupt. And that sometimes it only takes one act of resistance, one refusal to bow, to remind an entire community of what it truly means to belong. So the next time you hear about an HOA, about the endless rules and the people who enforce them, ask yourself, is it about order or is it about control? Because in this neighborhood, one Jeep answered that question forever,